Great.
So my guest today is Lucinda Lidstone, and she's a psychotherapist. And we met about 6 weeks ago. You emailed me after a podcast that I did with the sheep farm, and we set up a meeting and we did an interview of me. But I thought it's about time we return that favour, Lucinda. And I thought it'd be a good idea to interview you because I know what it's like when you're always on the interviewing side, and it's sort of, nothing seems to come back. So I thought let's turn the tables and interview you. So
Okay.
briefly, before we go there, I just want to say Lucinda's been working with Sonia Poulton on a weekly basis on Brand New Tube, and she's involved in a broadcast that Sonia puts out called Rise, and she does a weekly slot on well-being and psychotherapy and various issues that are coming up, in particular with relevance to what's going on in the world right now. And you've also got a well-being clinic called ASC Wellbeing Clinic. So tell us a little bit more about, for example, the clinic. How long has it been going? And then we'll move on to other things, Lucinda. What's going on?
Yeah. So the clinic has been going about 12 years now. Um, and it's a long story, but to try to make it more succinct, I was working in a private mental health hospital, and a distant relative of mine had just qualified in counselling. And I was working on the adolescent ward, and he was asking me my advice about going into private practice. And I said, well, I think a really underfunded area is with young children and adolescents, because that's the first place that the government at the time seemed to remove all the funding for. So I said, I think that's largely untapped area. Nowadays, everybody wants to work with young people, but back then, there was a real dearth of services in our area. So we both set up the clinic together. I've had different partners and different people put input into the clinic as time's gone by, but largely it was set up just to serve the needs of young people. And then when you work with young people, you realize very quickly that you have to address the whole family situation, obviously, with young people. So the clinic expanded into workshops for parents, supporting parents, and now really we deal with all ages. So we've got three areas. We've got a child service, an adolescent service, and an adult service. And we also do training and CPD and things like that as well. So yeah, so it's been up and running for 12 years. And then alongside that, I've got my private practice, which allows me to do the work that is really close to my heart, and that's work with spiritual crisis, which some people term psychosis, but that kind of thing. Anybody that's wanting to explore the spiritual or the non physical.
Wow, that's quite a difference of focus, isn't there? Sort of one sort of really run of the mill
Indeed.
common, things that people come in for every day, and then this spiritual crisis. So how do you reconcile that split, or do you just keep them completely separate?
Well, I think for me, that's been my whole personal journey, really, in my career, because I started off coming from the kind of the new age background, if you like. I did Reiki and different readings for people. And then that's where I started, really, because people would come for a reading and they would tell you things that they've never told anybody. And I would feel really ill-equipped as to how to help them. And so that's how I first got interested in counselling and psychotherapy. And then as I say, I worked in a private mental health hospital, and that was a very clinical environment, as you can imagine. It's quite competitive, and I really didn't think at all that there was any space for the spiritual or anything non-ordinary, as it might be. So I kept that side of myself quite secret, really. And then, so really, my whole personal career has been about trying to blend those two sides. Um, and now I'm kind of known for acknowledging and working with the spiritual. Um, but it's been difficult. It's been difficult because it has all sorts of connotations. People think as soon as you mention spiritual, they think you mean religious, and of course it can be religion, but that's very limited view. And you know, humans have all sorts of non-ordinary experiences all the time, and I just feel that we as professionals need to be open to whatever anybody wants to bring into the room. And it doesn't mean that you have to believe in things, but you have to be open, because otherwise there might be something really important to somebody that they can't bring into the session. And I think one of the first kind of risks I took like that was way back. I had a lady, lovely lady, whose son had been killed in Afghanistan, and I don't know why I disclosed it. I have no idea, but I ended up disclosing that I'd worked as a clairvoyant with people in the past. And at that point, she was able to then tell me, oh, well, I've been to a medium to try to contact my son. And there was a whole big important story around that, which if I hadn't mentioned my story so that she knew I was open to such things, she'd have never brought that into the session. And it was so fundamentally important to her to be able to discuss that. So, you know, I think in London, there are lots of courses and spirituality is talked about a lot. But I don't, in my local area, I still think that it's tick boxed, but I really don't. I think there's a lack of good knowledge around such things.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing when you said, you know, like when I say I work with spiritual, people hear religion, or they hear that
Yeah.
new age woo 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 love and light, you know, time thing, or they hear what they want to hear. I mean, spiritual is such a broad palette, isn't it? And you know, you said what I loved about what you said just then was like people come in with non-ordinary experiences all of the time. And I think, I don't know if you've experienced this in your regular practice as opposed to your spiritual practice, but people come in with a list of symptoms and they give you their symptoms like they would give them to a doctor. And then they want you to help them. Well, a symptom is meaningless unless it's attached to a personality and a history and a program and something that is meaningful to that client that they've construed in their mind and in their world experience and made into a problem. So even if it's non-spiritual, you still sometimes have to end up delving and delving and delving just to help the client understand that they're not just a collection of symptoms. Actually, they're a whole person in their own right. You know, they've got stuff that's hidden even from their own consciousness. And you know, it's a shame that modern psychotherapy, modern psychiatry, modern medicine has hived off that whole spiritual side of what makes life meaningful. I wondered if you'd got any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's touched on in existential training, obviously, because you talk about things such as purpose and meaning, and that's really where I start, because I say, look, even if you're an atheist and you think that this is just it, we are a meat suit, you have still got meaning and purpose to your life. You've got a reason for getting up in the morning. You have a way of understanding how the world works, how other people work, how you work. You have a certain blueprint for walking through life, even if you don't acknowledge the spiritual at all. So that's generally the place where I start. You know, what do you think the purpose of your life is? What gives your life meaning? What helps you motivate yourself? So just starting with those questions, you're already into that non-physical realm, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's amazing. I mean, I think the last 2.5 years have actually brought people, those who are at the teetering on the edge, have come into a fuller sense of who they really are. And it's pushed some people into a
I think
more
so.
yeah, and some others have been pushed into an even more disconnected state. Like they're so disconnected from who they really are that they believe everything they hear in the media as the truth. You know what I mean? So there's this been schism, hasn't there? I think. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's a really good point, because one of the things I was saying during COVID and the whole lunacy of it all was that's one reason I think that we were, well, not us, but a lot of people were able to be so manipulated, is because of the fear of losing life, wasn't it? It's the fear of death ultimately,
Yeah.
because death isn't really I know you maybe have a slightly different view, but I think generally death isn't really spoken about so much. It's kind of hidden. You know, people tend to die in hospital, don't die at home like they would have done 100 years or so ago. They're probably not laid out for everybody to come and pay their last respects to. So people don't necessarily see death and don't talk about death. And you know, we're always talking about cures, aren't we? And you know, we're going to crack this problem, we're going to find a cure for this and that and the other. And so I think there's this view that comes really from big pharma that, look, we can keep you alive at any cost, you know, and it's all about buying more time and buying more time. And we forget what we're here for. You know, what is the point of having a few more months and being like a little burnt out shell and not even being able to sort of recognize daylight? What is the point of that? You know, it's about your quality of life. And I think that's why that whole view and that ignoring death and dying and our limitations and our mortality, I think that is why people were so whipped up into such a storm, because all of a sudden death is there. It's a very real thing. It can come at you. It's there. It's in your neighbor or in your friend or in your family waiting to get you, you know. And I truly think that was a big factor in how we've been so controlled.
Yeah, and big pharma has just cashed in on the fear of that, and you know, of the whole fear of that. But paradoxically, it's then using that fear to administer something that's likely to cause death. So, in many people, so it's kind of like people have become a victim of their own lack of humanity, really, their own lack of connection to themselves, their own lack of connection to something meaningful and purposeful, which I think is what, you know, spirituality of sorts or some kind of meaning connects us to. It connects us to that deeper sense of context, doesn't it? It connects us to the context that we live in. And
Yeah, I think it's by design. I think it's all been done by design, you know. Or maybe it's just the fact that the way the pendulum swings, you know, if you think about it, a good few hundred years ago, we're largely ruled by the spiritual world, you know, by fear of God and fear of our priestly class and all the rest of it. And then science came in and all that new knowledge, and I think the pendulum swung so far out that way that if you can't see it, touch it or smell it or taste it, it doesn't exist. And I think we've got to, you know, really, it was the whole separation of church and state, really, isn't it? And it's, I think really that's done us a great disservice, because we've lost that sense of ourselves, that sense of our eternal self, and something beyond the material. I think that's really got lost.
Do you think there was a beginning to that, or do you think it's just a gradual process? Do you think there was a point in time when, you know, there was some kind of far-sighted idea that separating the church from the state would give the state more power? Do you think there was a point in time when that came around?
I don't know. I'm not. Before COVID, I'm just not politically aware at all. I've never studied so much politics as I have since COVID came in, at all. So I wouldn't know enough about political history to be able to say. I mean, I think probably what's more likely is the powers that be can see a trend, and then they jump on it and they twist that into whatever ways they want. But I do think, you know, we only have to look at health, for instance, and cancer. We know there's so much out there that says that, you know, there are ways to cure cancer. We're not even allowed to speak about that. You know, it's illegal to say that you can cure cancer. But we know that there's many alternative remedies and ways of working with cancer and other serious conditions. And why is there a law against that? You know, if the powers that be were really interested in our welfare, they'd want anything and everything to be available to us all, wouldn't they? They'd want that knowledge to be available. And instead, what happens? The people that come up with these remedies are systematically wiped out, discredited, struck off. So So yeah, I don't know. There are people that say, don't they, that it's been a big plan over centuries to get us to where we are. I don't know about that, but certainly I think this, in this day and age of us being able to access all sorts of information, there is a massive body of information that the powers that be do not want us to know about. And that's to do with health, but also to do with the powers that we have as human beings, you know, the power of our brains. You know, anybody that's got a close relationship with anyone has experienced telepathy, where you're with somebody close to you and they say something, you say, oh my God, I was just thinking that, or oh, I was just about to say that, or I'm thinking about you and you suddenly call me. You know, everybody's had that experience. So I think there's many things that it just suits them for us to not know about, or to have forgotten about, because obviously this knowledge has been known by our ancient ancestors. Of course it has. So I think we've lost a lot. That would be my view.
Yeah, it's gone into hiding, isn't it? It's sort of like people now are so bamboozled by the media and what the received wisdom of our age, that anything that digresses from that must be hocus pocus, you know, propaganda, whatever they want to call it, you know, like, what do you call it? What do they say? Conspiracy theories, that's the one. You know, stuff that can't be true.
Yeah.
But all you have to look at is what the World Health Organization put on their website within weeks of COVID breaking out, was that all of these natural health things that we know absolutely help, like vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, were all, no, this does not cure COVID. They were absolutely going to the nth degree to tell people that this does not work. And we know categorically that a strong immune system defends you from all sorts, and the way you strengthen your immune system is to have a healthy diet and healthy supplements if you need to take them. You know, I mean, it's easy peasy, isn't it?
Yeah, and they pay lip service to such things because we know that our immune system lives in our gut largely. And so they pay on lip service to it by saying, oh, you know, it's good for gut health, and, you know, have this little Yakult or whatever it is, you know, that's also got loaded with sugar and stuff like that. So they pay lip service to these things, but the real knowledge, they try to exclude or dumb down. And on the subject of dumbing down, you know, people have only got to open their eyes and just look at things. I was looking at some telly from the 1970s, 1980s. And I can remember years ago, my nan always used to have to watch the evening news, 10:30 at night or 10 o'clock at night, whatever it was. And when you go back and watch that, just the vocabulary that's used, the language that's used, and the way we were spoken to was completely different from how it is now. They spoke as though most of us had a level of intelligence and could understand what was being spoken about. And now it's all brightly colour popped, isn't it? Everything zing ping in your face. And the way we're spoken to is as though we're all children and we don't fully understand the English language and we can't get hold of broad concepts. So there's been definitely been a gradual dumbing down of our education, of everything. And you don't have to believe anything. All you've got to do is go back 30, 40 years and watch a bit of TV from back then, see how different it is.
Wow, I haven't had the pleasure of doing that, but that might be worth looking into, just to see the difference, because you know, I don't know if you saw the recent debate between Rishi Sunak and I think Liz Truss, which I don't have a television, so I don't catch it. I just catch the tiny little snippets that people put in their videos to show you what the ridiculousness of it, you know. But what struck me about that was this ridiculous to-ing and fro-ing between these adults, you know, that think they're winning the hearts of the people of the UK. But in fact, it just looks like some farce to me. You know, because I haven't watched television for 8 years. So it just looks like some ridiculous farce. I just can't believe that people sit down and watch that nonsense and then make an informed decision on who it is they want to rule the country. It just seems complete and utter nonsense.
But who even believes now, really truly even believes that it makes a difference who you vote in? It absolutely doesn't, does it? Nothing. there is an agenda, and that's going to play out no matter who. And whoever ends up in power will be who has been chosen to be there, and it won't be chosen by us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it'll be one of the boys, won't it? That they want in.
It'll be Rishi Sunak, no doubt about it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm certain too. So let's move on a bit. So I know that you have done quite a bit of work with hearing voices. I think you've done some study on it, and I think that also informed some of your practice. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with hearing voices? Because as you know, I was once schizophrenic. I don't think they really know what they're doing when they diagnose people, but let's go into your experience, because I'm fascinated to hear what you understand them to be, where they come from, who gets them, what's their background, etc., etc. What's the spiritual dimension to hearing voices?
Yeah. So when I was working in the hospital, I was working on the adolescent ward, and there was one guy that always sticks in my mind. He was hearing voices, and normally when people are disturbed by them, it's because the voices are very negative and they're very punitive. And he, every week, the psychiatrist would come in, see him probably more than once a week, and the voices would still be as bad. So his medication would be upped and upped and upped and upped, and he was walking around like a zombie, this poor young guy. And he was still tortured by the voices. And I got to thinking, okay, so I've come from a background where hearing voices in terms of spiritual voices or working with mediums or whatever is quite normal. And these people don't seem to be bothered by it, and can seem to be able to control it, turn it off, turn it on, and have an understanding around that. And yet here's these other people that are hearing voices that are absolutely tormented by it. And their voices seem to be very different from the voices that the mediums are hearing. So I thought, okay, why is that? And so what I did for my dissertation was I studied 3 different areas of people. So one group was just voice hearers who heard really negative voices. One group was shamanic practitioners that worked with hearing voices. And the third group was mediums. And so I did a big piece of research comparing all of those groups. And the one thing that was true of everybody was that everybody had suffered some kind of trauma. Now, you could say nobody escapes without trauma, but there was significant trauma in all of my participants. So what can you conclude from that? It would require further study. But one idea is that trauma, and there's been plenty of literature on this actually, that trauma opens up so-called psychic centers, if you want to call it that way, or opens up doorways in the mind that enables you to access this other stream of information. What I've learned though, Jerry, who we both know, Jerry Marzinski, he worked with schizophrenics, didn't he, in a prison largely.
Yeah.
And his view of their voice hearing experience was that it was negative entities that had attached themselves to them, and he really felt strongly in every case that that was what was happening. I absolutely think that's a possibility, but I think really there's many different manifestations of voice hearing, and yes, it could be a negative entity, it could be the spirit of your Auntie Dot or whatever, but also it can be your own internal voice that you're not recognizing. Now, the shamanic way of understanding that is that when you have a trauma, part of you, that part, so say you had a trauma at 8 years old, that part of you splits off and is lost in a dimension of its own. And so the work of the shaman is to encourage that part to come back. So you could say, well, what if it's the voice of that 8-year-old that you're just not recognizing as belonging to you? Or it can be, we've learned over the last 2 years, we've learned an awful lot about psychological programming, haven't we? So if you're very abused as a child and you get negative messages all the time drummed into you religiously, as it were, then somehow that that punitive voice of, say, your abusive parent gets lodged in your mind as though it's an identity in and of itself, still perpetrating you, even though you've managed to get away from the abusive parent. In some kind of way you've interjected them, and so you've got their voice constantly attacking you, and it's a kind of mind control, really. So I don't think there's one conclusive answer. And what I learned through my research, I spoke to a lady in New Zealand who did some fantastic work with voice hearers, and she's saying it really is about helping the person make meaning of their experience and understand it for themselves and try to interpret it, because you know as well as I do, Jenny, that the mind gives you information usually symbolically. So let's say you're hearing a voice and you believe it to be Jesus Christ. It's not a case of taking that literally. It's a case of unpacking that and saying, okay, so what does that represent? What's your idea of Jesus? What does he represent for you? So it really is about helping somebody unpack and discover the messages within their voice hearing experience. But you know, it can be terrible for people, because imagine even if you're with your best friend, if they were rabbiting at you constantly 24/7, you'd want to get away from them. So if it's a negative voice, it can be really, really traumatic for people if they feel that they can't turn it off. But I think that we can learn a lot actually from mediums with their, because you know, if you feel that you have mediumistic abilities, you can go and sit in circle, and what they teach you is how to open up, close down, and turn it on and off at will. And so I think there's maybe something we can learn from that practice that might help people that feel powerless to their voices. So I think that would be an interesting experiment to do.
It's interesting because those circles, I sat in one years ago, just before I was diagnosed schizophrenic, and I think, you know, you do have a lot of dubious people that dabble into that spiritual world. You know what I mean? And people think, well, because they can access it, then they think everyone else can access it in the same way. So it is a truly qualified shaman is someone who knows her way around that whole realm, that whole mentality, and is someone who's probably, you know, I would say, has to face their own darkness. You have to face your own darkness in order to know how to lead other people through theirs. Otherwise, if you're not facing your darkness will come and claim you. And because this is how I feel, at least, you know, the darkness gains momentum, it gains energy. The more you shut it in a corner and say, that's not me, go away, the more energy you give it, because you're spending such a lot of energy denying it's there. It gains momentum. And that's been my experience both with clients and with myself in the past, historically. So, you know, is there anyone qualified to do that? You know, how do we come across people that can actually are qualified to take you into opening and closing down appropriately and knowing how to navigate those other realms without denying their darkness? I mean, it's quite a conundrum, isn't it, really? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I entirely agree with you. You know, and people that access my private site as well. I've had some very unwell people contact me, because as soon as you enter into the spiritual realms, then you come across people that are very unwell, because it's what we call spiritual bypass, isn't it? You know, we think we can enter those realms and then become so detached from whatever's been causing us trauma, or whatever has hurt us in this human existence. So I think that's a really good point. You have to, my view is that you have to have a really good, solid sense of self before you do any of that expansive work, because you have to have a sense of who Jenny is to come back to, who Lucinda is to come back to. Otherwise you risk not only re-traumatizing but fracturing somebody. You know, there's a very real danger in that. And yes, how do we know who's trustworthy and who's not? It can only be by word of mouth, isn't it, and by recommendation, because I've met all sorts of and that was my naivety, really, as when I was young, thinking that because somebody was spiritual, and even in my profession now, because somebody's a psychotherapist, that they've got it all together, and that they're going to have your best interests at heart. And sad to say, that's not always the case, is it?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. I think, I don't know if we mentioned this in the time you interviewed me, but when I went into practice, I perhaps a bit like you, I really didn't want to bring my spiritual self into my professional practice, because I was kind of like, I wanted to, I didn't want to advertise myself as a spiritual person. I wanted to be professional. But along the way, even the professionalism, I went in to train and educate my colleagues based on a very broad basis, with my spirituality behind me. And they were looking for techniques and symptom resolution. And for me, that was kind of like so superficial. We need to see the whole person. We really do need to understand where somebody is, And the only way you can do that, we can do that as therapists, is to understand ourselves in our broadest spectrum. Otherwise, we only see what we want to see. We don't see the fullness that people bring to us,
Yeah, I mean, there's that phrase, isn't there, that you hear all the time in therapy training: you can only take your patient, your client, as far as you've gone. And I think that is so true on such a deeper level, because, as you just said, that you need to have tackled your own shame. Otherwise, you can't, nobody can bear it if somebody brings something shameful into the session. And indeed, you have to tackle your own shadow, because you have to know what those parts are that you've shoved in a box and hidden, and otherwise they come back to bite you. And I just don't think, even in our profession, Jenny, I just don't think a lot of people want to do that work. They just don't want to go there. And I agree with you. Yeah, tools and techniques, brilliant. But it's always in the context of your relationship with that person that you're sitting with, and they are the expert on them. And our tools are really of only limited help, actually. But everybody's always, I get parents coming in saying, oh, are you going to give my child tools to take away, blah, 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 blah. Everybody's focused on tools, but it's not. It's at the real heart of it. We all want somebody to understand us. That's what we all want. We want somebody to feel like someone cares, to understand us, and to feel validated, that our experience is of validity. And we all want that from each other.
Absolutely. And sometimes, I don't know if you've had clients, I'm sure you have, sometimes witnessing is enough. Just being a willing witness to validate and help that client feel less alone is enough. And literally 2 or 3 sessions of that and they're off. You haven't done anything. This is it. Sometimes, clients come back, oh, you've really helped me. Well, I didn't do anything. I just sat here and listened and witnessed and validated and, made it okay for you to feel like that or like that. And the minute you're witnessed and you say it's okay, oftentimes the momentum that was behind that loses its power, because you've just said it's okay. Oh my God, it's okay, really? Do you mean I'm not a nutcase for thinking like that or feeling like that? No, you're perfectly normal. Oh, do you know what I mean? The witnessing is like as therapeutic as any technique, I think, often.
Yes, and you can't fake it. It's got to be genuine witnessing. That's the other thing. Yeah. I can remember I had a young guy who was, let's say he was neurodiverse. You could say maybe he was on the autistic spectrum, but anyway, he thought very differently and he processed information very differently from anybody I'd ever met. And he was fascinating. And I was so fascinated with him that I wanted to take the time to understand how his mind worked and what he meant when he said things. And I only had about 4 sessions with him. And he emailed me a long time afterwards and said how he felt I changed his life. And like you, I'd done absolutely nothing other than want to be interested in how his unique mind functioned. And he was just so blown away by that. And that was because maybe I was the first person that made him feel normal, actually. Maybe that was all it was. But yeah, the witnessing, absolutely.
Yeah. It's funny, I think, like we're often drawn to areas of our own life that need resolution or have been resolved, and then we work on those same areas with other. It's almost like, whatever has happened to us has been of great benefit because now we can help other people in the same position. The danger is not to over-identify with your client and think, oh, their troubles are just like mine, oh my God, I've got to rescue them. That's a no-no. But I think, when you come from an informed shadow which knows, you've been through these trials and tribulations when you were young, it formed your character, it formed your programming, you've done some work, you've understood how the past has affected you now, and now you're equipped to help other people in the same way. But without the desperate need to rescue, which is an exhaustion. I think that just exhausts the best therapists. The people that want to work well with people just exhaust them if they over-identify. So what do you think, and this is an open question because I haven't got the answer, what drew you into adolescent? What was it? You don't have to go into great detail, but what was it that drew you to that area of work?
Well, truthfully, that would have been the last area I wanted to work with. I wanted to open a cancer healing centre, actually.
Wow.
Because my husband had died from a brain tumour. But life didn't take me that way. And yeah, so it would have been the last thing on my list that I ever wanted to work with. And then I go and create a clinic to work with that. but I think it's, as you say, Jenny, my adolescence, I would not want to revisit it at all. Let's put it that way. But I think that's the whole point. I had unfinished business with my own adolescence. And I think maybe that's why the powers that be decided that I was going to be working in that area. But honestly, I just go where the universe points me. Honest to God, that's how I run my life, really. And this opportunity opened up, and I really feel that I was just a vessel, and the clinic was meant to manifest, and I was just the person that made that happen. That's how I see it.
Yeah, lovely. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because that's also in keeping with your spiritual conscience or consciousness, isn't it? That there is a purpose to my life that is bigger than I can understand, and I just have to follow the clues.
Definitely. Yeah.
And going back to Jerry, I mean, Jerry's quite convinced that every schizophrenic he's ever met is demonically possessed, and he's written a whole book on it. And to be honest, I think probably the people he has met, he calls them the criminally insane. They've probably been deeply traumatized, deeply split off. Let's make an assumption that demonic attachment or demonic possession only attaches where there's trauma. Otherwise, there's nothing for it to feed off. Yeah, because sometimes I think what's happened in the last 2.5 years, we've got these Dementors. It's like Harry Potter's Dementors. They're all over the place, gobbling up everyone's fear and anxiety. And the media has been seeding all of this anxious energy and this constant lack of connection to our true purpose and our true sense of self. And it's just been seeding this terrible thing. And all these Dementors are just flying around, just sort of trying to suck up every last bit of, power that the whole agenda has given them, including the people that pull the strings. But maybe in Jerry's case, because he's working with people that are so traumatized and detached from themselves, maybe these entities are attaching to them. Maybe there are entities that are gobbling up the trauma and are feeding off the trauma. Maybe it explains why, all of the things that he talks about, that, they don't want the people to take the medication because it stops them getting a good foothold on their trauma. They can't soak it up. So maybe it's horses for courses in the sense that that's probably Jerry's speciality. But then when you move over into shamanism or mediumship, you're looking at different ways in which people are internalizing their childhood or, giving energy to programs that were set many, many years ago. And now it seems like they're separate to them. So I don't know if you think perhaps, the demonic attachment idea is valid at all, or are you saying it may not be that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. That fits in my belief system. Of course, I think there are negative forces. I've had experiences that absolutely would convince me of that. And, if you're your average everyday demon, where are you going to hang out? Of course you're going to hang out with the criminally insane, aren't you? Those that are into murder, rape and God knows torture and all the rest of it. Why wouldn't you? It's the demon's party, isn't it? Yeah. So I think absolutely that's possible. But we also know, don't we, that thought is form.
Yes,
there's a
absolutely.
lot about thought and creating form in spiritual teachings.
Yes.
And if you've ever journeyed round the esoteric or got involved with any kind of magical groups, they will teach you about creating a thought form to do your bidding. So you have to give it a birth and a death. So today I'm going to birth this thought form, and then in 2 weeks' time I'm going to give it a death, because you don't want this energy wandering around on the ether doing its own thing. And then you create this thought form with visualization, and you imbue it with whatever powers you want it to have, and you give it its job to do. And then you send it off and it does its thing and then comes back, and that's the end of that. So whether you believe that or not, there is so much now in quantum physics, as I say, in the esoteric world, in healing, where we do believe to some degree we create our own reality.
Yes.
So if you're having negative thoughts, like really deep, dark thoughts, then who knows from that perspective what you might be creating on the astral. We just don't know. So I just sit with the possibility that anything is possible. Yeah.
Excellent. I really love that answer, because it kind of dovetails with all things spiritual there, isn't it? It's not just demonic attachment, it's thought forms that gain power when you think them and you create a ritual around them. I mean, one of the things I don't think we spoke about, but I practice this form of Buddhism that's from Japan, which believes that whatever you set your mind to, you can create. And yes, that isn't a case of right, I've got a plan, it's going to go like this, this and this. It's a case of, right, I'm going to put it out in the universe, this is what I want. I'm going to look for clues potentially, but I'm not going to be too prescriptive about what it is I want. I just want to send this message to the universe and say, right, this is where I want to place my focus. And as you know, once you do that, things do manifest and materialize.
Absolutely.
And how is that any different to people that are putting out negative thought forms and putting out traumatic thought forms, and what they actually create and manifest? And this is a question you asked me, do you believe in evil? And this is where I feel there's a little bit more of a continuum, in the sense that what is evil? Evil is just something that's been dispossessed, marginalized, shut out, and feels angry and wants to do its worst because it's coming back at you. But can we integrate that side of us? Is that just a massive social shadow that nobody wants to admit is there? Do you know what I mean? On what level is that evil? I don't know. What are your thoughts about?
Well, oh gosh, what's the guy's name? The Road Less Travelled.
Oh yes.
People of the Lie. Oh, it'll come to us. That's
yes, it will. Yeah,
very well-known guy.
Yeah.
But he wrote People of the Lie. He was talking about small acts of evil. So, that we all do without really meaning to. If you gaslight somebody, if you don't tell the truth, maybe that's a small act of evil. It depends how you want to look at it. And I think humans are more evil, actually, than maybe those negative entities. I don't know. I think I don't know. I think anything is possible. Definitely. I remember a long time ago being in some kind of spiritual circle and turning to the woman that was sat next to me, and her eyes were black. Never seen anything like it, and it was really frightening. It was really terrifying. And I think to this day, I think something else was living in that woman, and I saw it, and it was deeply disturbing. But when I think of my patients that I've worked with, there's only one person I think maybe something else was with him, because he would he was such a passive, placid guy, this guy, and he would suddenly change. And when he changed, he would go, he wouldn't speak, and it was just something in his demeanor that would change, and all the hairs on my arms would stand up, and I would think, I can't bear to be in the room with you, and I would leave, and he couldn't stand it for much longer than 10 minutes. So I do think about him, and I think, maybe you had something else that wasn't human attached to you. But most of the other people I've worked with, hearing voices or having torturous intrusive thoughts, I think it's more the result of early childhood trauma that's just not been processed properly. So ultimately, that's all we can ever do, isn't it? Speak from our own experience. But if that's Jerry's experience, I would never dream of telling him that I think he's wrong.
Yeah, I know. And then, of course, like with myself, with the schizophrenia, my own experience, I suppose, was it evil? Was it demonic attachment? I don't know. It was certainly what you described earlier on, this opening of psychic centre, which accesses a different stream of information. That's what you said before. And it was certainly that. I was completely not in this realm. I was in a different realm and accessing different kinds of information. There was no question about it. Was it dark? I think there was an element of darkness to it, but I wasn't criminally insane. So, I wasn't criminal, let's put it that way. I was just unfortunate set of circumstances led me to that point. So, again, I'm like you, I'm happy to keep an open mind. And to be honest, when you're working with clients, you have to work within their idea of reality, don't you?
Of course you do.
Because
Yeah.
if you bring in your own sense of whatever you think it is, that could completely alienate them or turn them inside out. So I think you have to
But
work within. Yeah.
in Islam, they talk about that all the time, don't they, with the jinn? And it's in our language. When we do something, we go, I don't know what came over me. We'll say, or I just lost it, or so maybe there are things that take us over in our weak moments. Who knows? Who
Yeah.
knows?
I mean, it's funny, like last 2.5 years, it's exploded in all directions, isn't it, in terms of our
Yeah.
consciousness and our knowledge, especially those of us that were aware and awake and are realising what this was all about from day one. I know that, with me, my understanding and breadth of acceptance of the way in which our reality is conjured for us, and that millions of people all thinking the same thing conjures the very reality that they want, and that's never been more clear than in this last 2.5 years. So the breadth of understanding that I now have, of how groupthink creates the very reality that they want.
Yeah.
The media and the politicians and the WEF and the World Health Organization, this groupthink just creates our reality. And to be alone in that reality with your own understanding of what's happening can be quite overwhelming. I mean, what do you think? How have you dealt with the last 2.5 years, Lucinda?
Oh God, enraged most of the time,
Yeah.
because because it's the programming, as you're talking about. I found astounding how well it's been a great exercise in watching how you can control people and how their minds can be controlled and their behaviors can be controlled. And even people that I've known for years, who I've thought were highly intelligent, have just bought it hook, line, and sinker. And to me, it's just it's not because I'm a rebel, it's just because these things just didn't make sense. It's blatantly obvious to anybody that has any sort of thinking that these things were just nonsense. You know, if it really was the Black Death, you'd see all your neighbours being dragged out in the street. Where are the bodies? You know, it only takes a little bit of thought to realise that we're absolutely being lied to and manipulated. But my rage really is with my fellow human being who's just lost all sense of reason. But I think, as I said to you before, I think it's part of the plan to gradually dumb us all down. And what gets me is the paradox. You know, we've got the internet now. Anything you want to know is at the touch of a button, and yet in another way we're more ignorant than we've ever been. But when I think of the last 2 years, Jenny, I just think really right now we are in a battle of good against evil. I really do. I don't know. You know, people talk about the globalists or the 1% or the Illuminati, or, you know, who knows, or maybe even aliens. Who knows who's behind it all? But what I do know is that this is the most horrific act of evil on the whole of the planet, because it's global. And if they have their way, good God, it will be terrifying, won't it?
And I think, you know, like I remember saying to people right at the beginning of this that, you know, how do you think the internet came to be perfectly matched up, all broadcasting on the same frequency all over the world? How do you think that happened? You know, and this happened 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, that the internet came into being, and slowly over those 20, 25 years, people have got hooked up to it, and it is the same everywhere you go. You can hook up anywhere. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't one country saying, oh, I think we'll create an internet, and then them saying, oh no, let's hook up with the States. That might be a good idea. Oh no, let's hook up the States to... No, somebody stood at the top of that plan and said, we're going to have a World Wide Web, and this is what it's going to look like, and this is how we're going to use it, and this is how we're going to engage people in it. Yeah, otherwise it would have just been another fad that would have gone like Tamagotchi or some other silly thing. No, this was very well orchestrated to get a global World Wide Web, an internet, wasn't it?
And ultimately a global government.
And yeah, which is the next plan, or is it? I think we've already got it, to be honest. But do you know what I mean? So for people to say it couldn't possibly be true because they wouldn't roll out the same program in every country, well, that's precisely why it's true. Do you know what I mean? That's precisely why it's true. Because this isn't an accident. It's not an accident that every country in the world is grappling with the same diktats, the same laws, the same infringements, the same restrictions, the same... This isn't an accident. Who put the World Health Organization in charge of us? I didn't.
No, we didn't vote for it, did we?
No, and you know, it's just it's kind of incredible, like you say, that it is global, it is dark, and you know, we are in a struggle for our continuation as a human race. That if Yuval Harari, whatever his name is to be believed, that if we do become mixed with robotics or AI, we will no longer be human. We will no longer have human rights. I mean, this is deeply, deeply dark.
But yeah, and that really frightens me, and I avoid the transhumanist thing because it really freaks me out. It scares me. However, I think my spirituality saves me there, because I think that because they absolutely do not value the spiritual, and so they think we are just a meat suit, and that's why I can hook up with a computer. I think that will be their downfall, because I don't believe that you can generate... We know you can't generate life, because what are we? We are not our physical body. We are consciousness. And so I think that will be their downfall. Does that make sense?
It does, but they claim they can synthesize consciousness and they can synthesize life. They can, you know, they claim that these so-called preventative medicines, I'll call them because I don't want to use the other word, these preventative medicines can actually be injected into you, and they self-assemble within. Now, what they're doing when they self-assemble within is they're emulating the way in which the body repairs itself. And, you know, the cell repair and the way the body self-assembles itself when it has a cut or a wound, it self-assembles, it puts it right again. And they say that, you know, these preventative medicines are self-assembling, and they're causing us to have an AI interface within our body, which means that we're hackable. We are hackable, you know. And we're hackable by 5G and ultimately 6G that they're planning to bring in 2030. So, yes, you know, I don't think they have the consciousness that those of us that are wide awake and aware have. I don't think ultimately they can synthesize that, but they say they can. So those people that aren't awake are going to fall prey to it. That's how I feel. Those people that don't realise we're more than just a body, a meat suit, as you say. I think many, many millions of people, billions of people, will fall prey to the idea that, you know, they're in an alternative reality. They have a consciousness, and they can create this for them. I don't know. Just one, you know, just.
But I think it's that argument, that ultimate argument of free will, though, isn't it? You know, consciousness, ultimately consciousness is free will. And so they might be able to synthesize some kind of basic robotic consciousness, but it won't be consciousness as you and I understand it in that expansive sense. Because it would be an anathema, wouldn't it? You know, that consciousness is expansive, and this, what they're trying to do, is very restrictive and rigid and limited. And
let's hope they have their downfall. Did you ever see that sugar cube experiment that this woman did, or demonstration? Did you ever see it? She built a like a pyramid of sugar cubes. So it's quite large. So hundreds and hundreds, thousands probably of sugar cubes. And she tipped some blue dyed water into the bottom of the sugar cube. And as she spoke and explained, what happened was the water soaked into the sugar cube, and slowly the blue went up to the top. But what happened was the base of the pyramid just disintegrated, and then the top fell down. So to me, that signifies, I think, where we could all be going, which is that the more we reclaim our sovereignty, and I mean spiritual sovereignty, not just our practical sovereignty, because they've taken that off of us, but the more we reclaim our sovereignty and realise we don't have to kowtow or bow down to these diktats, the more that's going to sort of spread throughout the population and just destroy the illusion, the hypnotic state from the base, and the top's just going to have nothing to stand on. This is what I'm hoping and praying for. I pray every day when I'm chanting for, you know, the good to win. I'm praying always for people to be conscious and aware, and to reclaim their lives and stop jumping to these diktats that come from I don't know where, you know. So
I've been talking a lot. I've been talking a lot recently to Matt Lambo, who I'm doing a series with, chatting with Matt, and we were talking about this. We were saying, what's the tipping point? And actually, statistically, it only needs to be quite small. Some people say 11%, some people say 20%. But really, it's quite a small amount. And I agree with you. I think it will be grassroots. It will start from grassroots, because, you know, if you're gonna be a cashless society and we're all going to go digital, there will be those of us that step outside of that and say, "I'll tell you what, I'll go back to the old-fashioned barter system. So I've got this to offer, and let's exchange." Because people won't. Not everybody will want to sign up to that.
Yeah. Let's hope and pray. Let's hope and pray. So one last thing. So in the last 2.5 years, obviously you've done a lot of research. It's all you know, it's broadened your mind, like all of us. And you've obviously been put in touch with Sonia along the way, Sonia Polton, and now you're doing this program with her once a week on the brand new tube. So tell us how you met. How did you get involved in that, and what's that about?
Well, it really started from my own podcast. because at first, it's about 3 years or so ago, I think 2018, maybe about 4 years ago, I started doing my own little podcast, and it was just 10 minutes of me whittering on about whatever subject. And then someone said to me, oh, you know, this would be much more interesting if you have a conversation with somebody. So I happened to be reading an article that was written by a guy called John Hendon, and he was campaigning against the over prescribing of psychotropic drugs by psychiatrists. And so I interviewed him because it's something I feel very strongly about. I'm very, very anti-medication, obviously, but I'm very antidepressants and things like that because of what I've seen, and I don't believe them to be effective. Some people would say that they are for them, and fair enough, but on the whole, I don't think that they help people. And so I was doing this interview with John, and we had such a rapport, and I was so fired up by his own passion, really. And so we formed an organisation called CAPDA, CAPDA, and it was to support people and to hopefully be able to bring a class action against egregious psychiatrists who still insist on over prescribing. So we set up this organisation and got in contact with Sonia, and she had us on a couple of times, the two of us. And then she was, just to talk about that, and then she was developing her morning show and approached both of us and said, oh, would you do a regular slot? So John does the Monday and I do the Friday, and it's expanded from there. And they very kindly promote my podcast that I do every week and put it on Brand New Tube. So, but it really, if it weren't for meeting John and being swept along in his wake, really, then maybe none of this would happen.
Wow.
But as we said at the beginning of the session, Jenny, it's just opportunity. This comes my way, I'll be open to it, and I just go where I'm guided.
Wow. I love your ability to sort of develop things quickly. It looks quickly from the outside. It may not be so quickly within, because I've tried over the years to develop things, but I love the way you network and you sort of develop things quickly, and things seem to get moving. They build their own momentum and you run with it. That sounds really quite exciting. Yeah.
Well, yeah, or maybe it's just reckless. I do tend to jump and then worry about it later. I'll say, yeah, I'll do that, and then think, oh my God.
Bless you.
Yeah.
Bless you. So where can people find you online? Have you got a website and an email address? How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so if you're interested in my psychotherapy work and the clinic, the wellbeing clinic with all ages, just psychotherapy and counselling, that's ascwellbeingclinic.co.uk. If somebody wants to work with their spirituality, then that's soulsustenance.co.uk, and then you'll find all my stuff. My podcast is called Ask It, as you can see behind me, and that's mainly on Brand New Tube, so you'll find me on there.
Wow, that's great. There's a lot of places that you're hanging out there. So there was one last question I wanted to ask you. What the hell was it? It was in my mind a few moments ago. What was it? I can't remember. So that's where you. Oh yeah. Any last question? Any last thing you want to share? What's your favourite client? What kind of people you're looking to work with? What's the last thing you want to share with us?
Really, I just want to hear from people that have had unusual experiences. I love it when someone comes in and says, oh, don't know what you might think about this, but blah 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 blah. I love that. I like working with people, not when they're in psychosis, but so-called, but when they come out the other side of it. I like to do that work to help them integrate their ideas and experiences. But anybody that wants to work deeply over a period of time, then they're the people I like to work with. Absolutely.
Okay, lovely. Oh, you're a woman after my own heart. It's nice to have meaningful work to do, isn't it? Really good, meaty work to work with.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to interview you today and to get your take on things. I've learnt a lot from you just
Oh,
listening
thank you.
today, so that's been really great. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.